they left impossible borders that masqueraded as partitions of nation-states. Africa is going to give us something which will be quite different from our old ideas of the ineluctable connection between nations and states. The partition of Africa by the imperial colonial powers lead ultimately to the establishment of some 48 new states, most of them with clearly defined boundaries. Each independent African state is made up of a whole host of different ethno-cultural groups and nations having different historical traditions and therefore interstate boundary disputes. Not only did these artificial boundaries create multi-ethnic states, they ran across pre-existing groups, ethnicities, states, kingdoms, and empires. Some of the states that emerged from the partition were giants, like the Sudan and Congo. Some states have miles and miles of coastline, while others are landlocked with no access to the sea. Some have no borders, and then some states, like the Gambia and Somalia, have only a border or two to police. Others have 4 or more, and Congo has 7. How can a state without access to the sea or without fertile land really develop? Can one imagine the problems of security and of smuggling confronting these states with so many borders to patrol? End of quote. So Spivak asks us to think in new terms about nation-states in order to adjudicate some of these problems. We cannot rest easily with the idea that the state represents a given nationality, understood as monolithic and monolingual. We cannot rely on such definitions when we are thinking about contemporary nation-states. She writes, and I quote, Hannah Arendt was prescient when she talked about the fact that nation-states, the connection of nation and state, is just a blip in history, a moment, a transient and historically contingent moment. Spivak voices sharp skepticism about the story we have received about how the nation-state is now broken up, replaced by a global order which ought now to be regarded as our collective home. Again, quoting from her, the analysis of Africa, in her view, shows us that this view is anachronistic. Africa is also the place for the experimentation of non-governmental organizations, and even, as Spivak puts it, a laboratory for thinking and doing non-nation-centered states. There is no connection between the language boundaries of Africa and so-called national boundaries. This is not merely the case because of the existence of tribal languages, again, her language, although that too is important, as it is in Latin America, in the Indic context in South Asia. By contrast, what is interesting is early bilingualism between Aboriginal and Indo-European languages, and this is not a European encounter. So again, what is our model of translation? Let us think about these histories, hardly peripheral to the topic of the nation-state. Interestingly enough, Spivak ends here with recourse to the problem of translation. In her terms, the act of cultural translation is the way of bringing about a new understanding. I want to suggest that this idea sustains strong resonance with my own concept of performativity. Performativity characterizes both the singing of the nation-state and Arendt's conception of how we exercise rights. And Spivak's point is that we cannot imagine a state as corresponding to a single nation, where the nation is understood as culturally uniform and monolingual. The examples from Africa that she cites show that the borders of the state divide populations from one another, but also force populations together who do not share linguistic or cultural ties. Such states produce disenfranchised populations who are regularly exploited by state-sponsored capitalism. Precarious populations, to be sure. So there is no return to the monolingual nation-state, no matter what the English-only partisans maintain. The task of cultural translation thus emerges as a crucial way to produce alliance across difference. What she promotes is not a simple multiculturalism, but a practice of translation as a condition of subject formation, even a way of dispersing the very notion of the subject. How then do we take up this task to think about translation as a performative exercise? Is it not translation that takes place when the U.S. anthem is sung in Spanish? And is it not translation that characterizes the everyday life of multilingual states and non-state institutions of governmentality? Spivak notes that the indigenous poor have to acquire dominant language in order to be represented by politics and law. And this means that those who fail to translate into monolingualism have no chance to assert rights within recognizable codes. So it's all very well that Arendt identifies for us, we might say, in ideal terms, the kind of rights that those without rights can exercise. But can they always do it? Can they always exercise rights performatively? Does their effort to exercise a right performatively induce the right they exercise? Now, for Arendt, the way of exercising rights is presumed to work even when there are no supporting conditions, although she knows it does not always work. What Spivak teaches us is that under conditions of subalternity, especially within the global South, the only way to lay claim to rights is through assimilating to those dominant languages and juridical structures which were not only built upon the effacement and exploitation of indigenous cultures, but continue to require that same effacement and exploitation. Indeed, the very act by which one petitions for rights within those legal strictures reconfirms the power exercised through that law, a power of the state which, in the service of global capital, reproduces the stateless class. In this context, then, the practice of translation, which is something other than an assimilation to monolingualism, is a way of producing performatively another kind of we, a set of connections through language that can never produce a linguistic unity, that do not belong to the idea of the nation. This is why Spivak tells us that translation is the experience of the impossible, which is not the same as saying there is no translation. The point is to negotiate the right to speak, the right to lay claim to rights, and to make sure that the voiceless are given a right to speak. This obligation cannot be the same as supplying or imposing that voice. It is an impossible and necessary bind, but also a model for collectivity that does not presuppose sameness. We can then return to the question, what does it mean to lay claim to rights when one has none? It means to translate into a dominant language, not to ratify its power, but to expose and resist its daily violence, but also to find the language through which laying claim to rights becomes possible. Like those squatter movements that move into buildings in order to establish the grounds to claim rights of residency, sometimes it is not a question of first having power and then being able to act, but sometimes it is a question of acting, and in the acting, laying claim to the power one requires. How then does this example lead us back to the question of performativity and precarity? I hope we can see that the various modes of laying claim to public space, to language, even to citizenship, require both translation and performative modes of expression. But let us remember that performativity does not just refer to explicit speech acts, but also to the reproduction of norms. Indeed, there is no reproduction of the social world that is not at the same time a reproduction of those norms that govern the intelligibility of the body in space and time. And by intelligibility, I include readability in social space and time, and so an implicit relation to others and to possibilities of marginalization, abjection, and exclusion that is conditioned and mediated by social norms. Such norms are made and remade, and sometimes they enter into crisis in the remaking. They are vectors of power and of history. There are those who have limited access to intelligibility, and there are others who epitomize its symbolic iconography. So the reproduction, for instance, of gender norms within ordinary life is always, in some ways, a negotiation with forms of power that condition whose lives will be more livable and whose lives will be less so, if not fatally unlivable. Now, the theory of gender performativity has presupposed that norms are acting on us before we have a chance to act at all, and that when we do act, we recapitulate the norms that act upon us, perhaps in new and unexpected ways, but still in relation to norms that precede us and exceed us. In other words, yes, norms act on us, work upon us, and this kind of being worked on makes its way into our own action. By mistake, we sometimes announce that we are the sovereign ground of our action. But this is only because we fail to account for the ways in which we are in the process of being made. And indeed, if I depart from Hannah Arendt, it would be precisely here that this exercise of rights is a kind of freedom of self-making, and I think we only indeed exercise rights because we are acted on already by various conditions that make the exercise possible. We do not know, for instance, what precisely the norms of gender want from us, and yet we find ourselves moved and oriented within their terms. When a child is gendered, that child receives an enigmatic demand or desire from the adult world. We might even say the primary helplessness of the child is in this case a profound confusion or disorientation about what it is that gender means or should mean. A confusion as well about whose desire, the desire for gender, belongs, to whose desire it belongs. If what I want is only produced in relation to what is wanted from me or what I have received from another's desire, then the idea of my own desire turns out to be something of a misnomer. I am in my desire negotiating what has been wanted of me, and indeed what forms of desire I've been exposed to. If we take this perspective, then gender performativity does not necessarily presuppose an always acting subject or an incessantly repeating body. It establishes a complex convergence of social norms on the somatic psyche and a process of repetition that is structured by a complicated interplay of obligation and desire, indeed, a desire that is and is not one's own. When we act, and we act politically, it is already within a set of norms that are acting upon us, and in ways that we cannot always know. When and if subversion or resistance becomes possible, it does so not because I am a sovereign subject, but because a certain historical convergence of norms at the site of my embodied personhood opens up possibilities for action. It bears directly on my ability to persist. And even though we sometimes surely plan actions, deliberate on what course to take, resolve upon intentions, it's not finally possible to think of pursuing subversive strategies exclusively as a fully deliberate and intentional set of acts. Certainly we can and do try and discern various strategies that might more fruitfully, more effectively contest dominant gender norms. Those strategies are essential to any radical gender and sexual politics. But we would make a mistake if we thought that we might remake our gender or reconstruct our sexuality on the basis of a deliberate decision. We do not belong exclusively to ourselves in that regard. And even when we decide, for instance, to change gender or indeed to produce gender in new ways, it's on the basis of some very powerful desires that we make such a choice. We do not precisely choose those desires. Of course, gender and sexuality are different issues, but I do not think they can be fully dissociated. Certain forms of